Good evening, Belfast. I'm sorry I can't be with you at the Imagine Belfast Festival, but COVID virus means everything, hopefully, will soon be on lockdown and should be on lockdown already. It would be crazy to travel and crazy to put people in a room together at a time like this. But I do want to talk to you about my book, Clear Bright Future, and about my work, all, I think, now framed in the context of coronavirus, because it's the elephant in the room for people like me who are journalists who are covering the crisis, politically active journalists trying to influence it. There's nothing better to talk about than this, because there's a huge amount of confusion. So I hope you don't mind it. We'll skip a lot of the philosophical stuff that's there in my work and go straight to the point here. So the title of the talk is Capitalism After the COVID Virus. What do we need to change and why? So let's start by summarizing what happened. What happened with the virus? It broke out in China, it quickly spread to Iran, it spread to Italy, and everywhere it spread, you saw the weaknesses of the civil society that was hosting it. So in China, the immediate problem was they arrested people who said, hey, we've got a virus situation. In Italy, leading quite decent bloke recently, decent bloke, Zingaretti, the leader of their Socialist Party, appeared with a kind of aperitif saying, you know, don't give up your way of life just because we have a virus. Weeks later, he was down with the virus. And what's happened here in the United Kingdom is, of course, that we've run into the existential problem that we always have, which is a bunch of amateurs who think they can run society. The kind of enlightened gentlemen amateurs of the Bullingdon Club thought that by ignoring it for 2 months, so the first UK case was on the 31st of January, but we knew it was coming. First UK case, 31st of January, first Cobra meeting, early March. First, so they ignored it. And then when they had the Cobra meeting, what did they do? They just adopted a kind of, I call it the Sergeant Wilson strategy. I don't know if you remember in Dad's Army, that character, Sergeant Wilson. He's meant to be the sergeant of the platoon. And when the officer tells him to get the men in line, he always says, would you mind awfully standing in line? Well, this was the Tory attitude. Would you mind awfully locking yourself into your house? And people haven't done it. And so we're now on a, it's hard, the data is hard because we don't know how many people have really got it. But the number of infections is increasing in the UK, as far as we know, exponentially, and so are the deaths. So that means we're about 2 weeks behind Italy. And let's remember, before we all get into the horrible phase of it, which is coming, that we could have stopped it. We could have done what South Korea and Japan have done, which is really stop it, stem the spread, contact trace, rigorously test and isolate people. And by now the curve would be flatter, and it's not. So over the weekend now, we've got UK politicians. What they're saying in public is they're outraged by people going to the beach or going to parks. They're actually terrified because the word I keep hearing used in security circles talking about this is the underclass. See, what the people in charge have this view of people who disobey requests not to go to Brighton or Skegness and turn up on the beach, is that they must in some way be an underclass, a kind of other set of people, not really part of British society. Well, sorry, that it is British society that did that. And the reason is well, the contingent reason is quite clear. There'd been no clear advice. You know, during the HIV epidemic, crass though it was, that horrible scare story, tombstone falling on, advert that Thatcher put out, it was effective. Because if you want people to not turn up at the beach, you've got to say, if you turn up at the beach, you are breaking a social code. You've got to have celebrities on saying, look, anybody who does this is an idiot. It's like in Australia, they have public information messages about not taking bottles of alcohol onto beaches. I mean, don't be that person who is going to spread this disease. And we've had nothing like that. It's all been, and I write about this in the book, Clear Bright Future, it's all been done through so-called nudging. And nudging is what's important to understand is that the nudge strategies all stem from a view of human beings that we are essentially market behaviorists, that our entire behavior mirrors that of a market, and that we can only be made to do things not by the state saying we have to do it, but through market incentives nudging us to achieve things that the state wants. Well, that didn't work either. So I hope today we'll get a lockdown. And I think that if we get a compulsory lockdown, and it will probably be tightened stage by stage. So first of all, don't go out except for, you can walk your dog like in France, you can go jogging, etc. That will be the start. But in the end, I think they'll just bring it, do not leave your threshold of your front door. So you're going to be prepared for that, because it is the only way to flatten an exponentially rising curve of infection. But it's doable. The real problem behind it that might be intractable is the economic problem. And I want to talk a bit about this. So what has the government done economically? Well, first of all, nothing, again. Then in the budget, because why was the budget having to be scrambled together? Because in February, they were still obsessed with fighting each other over Brexit. The so-called Dominic Cummings clique in Downing Street wanted control over the Treasury so that they could get the Treasury to underwrite a hard Brexit and obviously in Northern Ireland, a hard border with Treasury money. And Sajid Javid wouldn't do it, and and the symbol for this was he wouldn't relinquish control over his advisors to Cummings's people. So they sacked him. So right in the middle of a crisis, they sack the key guy, and they bring in Sunak. And what does Sunak do? First of all, 12 billion of fiscal stimulus in the budget. You remember 2 weeks ago, was it 2.5 weeks? He's there giving this amazing, very eloquent, very coherent, kind of classic, elite politician coherence. They're all slapping him on the back. Within a week, he had to forget 12 billion. He was offering 330 billion, 15% of UK GDP, in soft loans to big business to try and bail them out. And then a week after that, he had to give an unlimited guarantee. So we don't know. But believe me, it'll be bigger than 330 billion. We don't know how much the government will have to spend to keep the private sector afloat in the United Kingdom. We've now got Goldman Sachs predicting, so in over those 3 weeks, it's gone from economists like the OECD predicting a mild recession to now Goldman Sachs basically predicting a slump in the world economy. So when the world economy grows at 2%, it's a world recession. They're now saying it's going to shrink by -1%, which is worse than what happened in 2008. And I think even that may be an underestimate. No. What we then hear from politicians is, yes, but the real economy will bounce back because it's fundamentally sound. Well, the point of the work I do and others who agree with me is to say it is not fundamentally sound. And even if it bounces back, it will have to bounce back in a different form, because we're not just dealing here with the impacts of a virus. We're seeing a virus hit an already weakened world economy. And I'm going to spend some time talking about that because I think it is the key to understanding where we go next. So in my book, Post-Capitalism, which came out in 2015, I talk about something I now call this the contingent crisis of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the system we've adopted since the mid-1980s, 1990s, of globalization and free markets. And people on the right often complain if people like me use this word neoliberal. They say it's just an insult like fascism. It doesn't mean anything. Well, to me, it does mean something. It means the coercive imposition of market norms of behavior into all aspects of public life by the state. That's what neoliberalism is. It's not just an ideology, it's a political strategy, and it's a system that has been created, which unfortunately for the people who thought it was timeless and perpetual, actually turns out to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning was Thatcherism and Ronald Reagan. The middle was Blair and Clinton when it worked. The end is 2008 onwards. Excuse me, I'll take this, just decline this call. The end is 2008 onwards with the financial crisis and now this. So the neoliberal system was fundamentally premised on, remember what happened in the 70s and 80s, the smashing up and atomization of working class life and working class resistance to capitalism. And there was a reason that had to happen, because the working class were incredibly strong. I remember, and some people listening to this will remember, times when, you know, workers could shut down entire societies. You yourselves had it, you know, with the in 1974. But so they smash the working class. What happens? The bargaining power of organized labor collapses. Wages collapse. So that's the internal problem of a society like Britain. At the same time, the opening up of China, Russia, India, Latin America to global capitalism, it doubles the size of the workforce in the world. So millions of people, billions in fact, get drawn from the countryside to the cities. There's 1 billion people live in absolute abject slums, which we thought had gone, now they're back. But this process of urbanization and commercialization also means then it opens up, you know, you can forget high wage, high skilled jobs in a place like Leigh in Lancashire, where I come from. I think in Belfast it's self-evident that world itself, even with the existence of people like Bombardier and Shorts, just has shrunk into a tiny enclave of what it used to be. So the bargaining power of workers collapses, and what we call the wage share also collapses. So the share of wages of national income falls, and what replaces it is profit. And increasingly, those profits are not simply extracted from us through work, like they were in my dad's generation, but through rents, through interest, through consumption, and through data mining. So we are now a kind of multiply exploited workforce, and work, you know, becomes almost kind of ephemeral. As long as you've got a job, you can have a credit card, you can have a cell phone contract, you can have a Sky, you can have a Sky contract or whatever at Netflix, and you're paying out of your wages all these things to different kind of capitalism. No, it worked for a time, and it coincided with the technological revolution, which helped it. But in the end, what I argue in post-capitalism is that, first of all, the technological revolution is disrupting capitalism's ability to adapt. So you can't replace, if something becomes cheap because it's really, really easy to produce technologically, you can't replace it very easily with a more expensive thing. That expensive thing is also produced digitally. So the whole secret of survival of capitalism, which was to replace low-skilled jobs with machines, but then to create new high-skilled jobs, that's gone out the window. That's problem number one. Problem number two is, as workers' wages decline compared to all the different sources of profit and the masses of profits that the new kind of capitalism is generating, they had to go into debt. And the 90s for many people were a story of credit cards, more credit cards, you know, offers dropping through your doorway, and then came student loans, then, you know, automobile finance. So in the end, everything in society is driven by credit rather than wages. And people like me said, this can't last, because what's happening is that the amount of debt people are taking out, both households, businesses, and states, is not sustainable anyway, mathematically. You know, if you've got an income base that isn't growing and debts that are rising, in the end, the interest rates will overwhelm you and the debts will overwhelm you. But on top of that, we've got this problem of the kind of failure of the technological revolution to generate a new dynamism within capitalism. So a lot of if you look at the share price of the top 10 companies in the world, only one of them is not a technology monopoly. That's Berkshire Hathaway, which is an investment company. But if you look at these big tech firms, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, their share price is basically premised on them eating the rest of capitalism. They will have to have all the profits generated by the rest of capitalism to justify the share price they have now. But my premise is those profits aren't going to exist, because the way technology has disrupted capitalism means that, so the only reason that, say, iTunes or what is now Apple Music can make a profit is not because of some ingenious technology that they produce or some amazing skill among their workforce. It's that they have gained a technological monopoly over music, and they're able to dictate a price. And this is something new in information technology that gives big firms absolute price formation power. Now, why should we be worried about this? Because look what's happened. In 2008, this entire growth model based on high debt collapsed. And what happened is that the state had to step in. The state put capitalism on life support, both through the state ownership of banks, as we saw in both Northern and Ireland and the Republic, and here in Britain, both through that, and more importantly, through quantitative easing. Because, so what happened? Since 2008, the entire total of debt in the world has probably risen by about 60 trillion. It's now 250 trillion of debt. And the amount of money simply printed and sort of given to banks by central banks is 20 trillion. And so it's on a kind of life support. The problem then became, in the ensuing period, that you can keep an economy on life support, but you can't keep an ideology on life support. The human brain demands coherence. And people are saying, hold on a minute, how is my child supposed to have a better life than me when they're just in debt? And how is it that the banks get all the upside of the risks they took, and people like us get all the downside? So the ideology that had sustained the coherence of this neoliberal model just blew up. And in the book, I say that in the 2011 revolts, the Occupy movement, the occupation of the squares in Europe, the Arab Spring, what we saw was people offering us a future. We'll say, well, there's an alternative to the kind of capitalism you've got. And people in power said, no, thanks, we don't want that future. So what we've now got, and what we had in the run-up, in the 2-3 years in the run-up to today, we had the return of the past. All over the world, you've got authoritarian conservative politicians basically using the methodologies of the 1930s. Fake news, for that read, the kind of propaganda that Orwell, was so terrified of. Authoritarianism, every police force is militarized. You've got the divide and rule strategies. You've got the otherization of minorities. All these are straight from the playbook of the 1930s, and a lot of gullible people are going along with it because their dream of a successful free market capitalism, globalization benefiting everybody, just fell apart. Now, I'm going through this because this was what was bad before coronavirus. People like me and some quite mainstream economists, to be honest, were saying we're after 10 debt-fueled years, fueled by debt and quantitative easing. We're not going to be able. We need. There's going to be a crisis anyway. The top of the market's been reached. We need a new model of capitalism. So, but is anybody prepared to outline it? Yes, we were. Those of us in the UK Labour Party, whatever you think of it, we did. We offered an alternative model, one based on state intervention to direct investment, a huge investment in climate, and I'm coming to climate technology in a minute, and redistribution from the top to the bottom. But, it's fairly decisive. People massively voted against it. People said, no, we'd rather have Brexit, okay? Brexit first, so the British Empire, some people say. So deluded us though that is, that's where we were on the eve of this crisis. But now it's going to be different. And I wanted you to talk about this using the analogy of a building with a roof and some foundations. And it's not, it's just a simple analogy. So what happened in 2008, what it looked like was this. The roof, the financial system, all those glittering buildings, the sort of hazy cloud of interconnected and opaque transactions fell in and damaged the structure. But the structure survived in a way. You could say that the state and the real economy did survive because the state, the state backed it in the end. And so eventually we were able to rebuild the roof, which is the financial system, and they're a little bit safer, to be honest, in places like Britain, where the Bank of England adopted new prudential powers, new regulatory powers, forced banks. Remember, those of you who remember 2008 will remember when the Irish banks had no capital left. So the banks are now forced to keep a cushion, turns out to be 190 billion, that they've built up against a future crisis. So, right, this time it's different, because what the coronavirus will do is collapse the foundations. The foundation of capitalism is people's work and ability to work, and we're compelled to work by the system. The reason people are getting shouted at this morning for getting on tubes, underground trains in London that have been severely curtailed, and so they're equally crushed now, highly dangerous. Everybody's saying, you idiots, you effing idiots, they're saying. Why? They have to go to work, otherwise they'll lose their jobs. We've actually, we built a society on compulsory work, and for the next 6 months or so, maybe longer, compulsory work is out the window. It's a bad thing. And so what's now going to happen is, in the 2008 crisis, demand slumped because people, couldn't pay their debts, and their companies were laying them off, and their mortgages couldn't be paid, and the state stepped in to save that. This time, both demand and supply are slumping. The supply chains of automobile companies, Apple stores have closed, not just to protect the public, but because China isn't making enough Apple things. So we're not just going to see a V-shaped slump. So it falls, it comes back, because the severe weaknesses that we accumulated during the run up to 2008 that were never properly addressed afterwards, and then the debts and the obligation to central banks to keep things going, which we've never weaned ourselves from. We were metaphorically on life support for 12 years after 2008. That weakened us. And I think it's specifically weakened some advanced world economies. And I think both the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland fall into that category. So I want to read you now from a fairly stunning, if I can find it on my computer, a fairly stunning investment note by a firm called Macquarie Wealth. Now, Macquarie is like a sort of really famous company that more or less dominates Australian capitalism. Macquarie Wealth's investors, this is a quote from them last week, writing about the economic impact of coronavirus. We have been arguing that conventional capitalism is dying, or at least mutating into something that would be closer to a version of communism. This transition would be marked by cross-currents and external shocks, e.g. coronavirus. Ultimately, a fusion of monetary and fiscal levers, so the Bank of England basically giving the state the money to bail out society, will lead to MMT-style policy. So MMT, modern monetary theory, is just, give money away, write off the debt by printing money, effective nationalization of capital, universal income guarantees, and deep changes in work practice. Today's economic investment strategies are built around concepts of a monetary world and the ultimate primacy of the private sector. The ultimate primacy of the private sector and its ability to navigate well-defined business and capital market cycles. Alas, the world has already moved far away from these principles. So what Macquarie is saying there is that Paul Mason is right. Although they're not really saying that, they are saying that the fundamentals of capitalism are shifting, and it won't look very much like capitalism after this. Because let's think about why. Everything I do, not just my work, but my gym membership, my spending in my local pub, my season ticket to a football team, all of these things aren't just transactions. What happens in a highly financialized economy based on debt and complexity is that the financial system takes my gym membership, wraps it up with the gym memberships of other people, projects the gym memberships of people not yet born who might join the gym in 20 years' time, and basically then says, right, you can buy into these profits with a security, with a financial security, an investment vehicle. So most of the world's economic activity going forward into the future has already been factored in to the price of of the financial products we already have. And so if it's permanently disrupted, then there will be a huge hit and possibly a meltdown of the financial system. And then suppose we recover. So we're seeing now airlines bailed out. Airlines bailed out by governments. Fine, that's good. We should do that. They should take a stake. Sometimes they should just nationalize them. But then the idea under normal capitalist conditions is, well, okay, in maybe 2 or 3 years' time, we'll re-privatize them, and we'll get back our investment. Bullshit. It's not going to happen. Why? Because who's going to buy airline shares in a world where, when's the next COVID virus coming along? Because we're in a new kind of risky environment. And so these Macquarie analysts are, I think, absolutely right. And it's a stunning thing to hear capitalists basically predicting the end of capitalism. But I'm afraid that is one of the extreme possibilities. For me, the more urgent thing is to build a new kind of capitalism around redistribution, state intervention, state ownership, and high-tech, high-skilled, high-paid jobs. But we have to recognize that those high-skilled, high-paid jobs won't really cover everybody. And therefore, society will then be faced with a dilemma that it doesn't really want to face, which is, how do we move to a low-work society? Because most of our cultures, whether it's Marxism, social democracy, Catholicism, Protestantism, Islam, are all based on work. They all value work. Work is the source of status. And people like me have been saying for 20 years, we have to move away from utopias based on work and think more about well-being. And what better time to be thinking about that than during a viral epidemic? Let's be clear about what this is, because in many ways, the response to it is a kind of crystallization to the long-term failure of, it's a kind of crystallization of all the problems we've had long-term in our failure to deal with climate. Climate and no COVID virus are seen by economists as, the word is exogenous shocks, external shocks, like an asteroid hitting an otherwise blameless planet. It's not our fault, we'll deal with the crisis, but it wasn't me, Gov, is the kind of response. This is wrong. The COVID virus is not an external problem to capitalism. The COVID virus was, obviously it's created by, many of these viruses, zoonotic viruses, are created by animal viruses crossing over into human beings. Why might that be suddenly happening? Well, first of all, because we're destroying the natural environment of things like bats, flying foxes, all kinds of birds in which these viruses are endemic, are being forced out of their natural habitat. That's the first thing. Next, we've recreated the fetid slum of the 19th century, which we thought we'd got rid of. In fact, you can even hear people arguing slums are good. So 1 billion people now live in slums. I've covered them, say in Manila in the Philippines, where people live literally over a river full of excrement in one room. It's just disgusting. And of course, they're always blamed by the rich. Why are you living like this? Well, they're living like that because we have forced millions of people into a rapid urbanization program, the like of which, it's absolutely parallel to what Stalinism did in Russia. And if you look at Russia, everybody said how cruel it was that they forced them all to leave their farms and go into factories. Well, that's what we've done. But in the process, unlike Russia, we didn't provide them with any public health sanitation. And so we've created breeding grounds for viruses. What then? We create a global economy in which there's very little regulation. And so even now in Britain, Europe's locked down to outside travel, Britain's not. So nobody's asking why. It's impolite to ask why are flights still landing from Iran and China. And quite naturally, nobody wants to be xenophobic. But so we create a global way of transmitting these things. And then what else have we got? In all developed world societies, and we're really going to feel this now in Britain, we've got a highly unhealthy, poor population. Now, it's a fact. It should lead to no complacency that something like 80% of the people who are dying of COVID virus have what they call comorbidities. These are obesity, lung disease, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and other things. Now, many of these things are products of poor lifestyle, poor health, poor lifestyle, poverty. So we've kind of created a target. We've painted a target on the back of Western developed world populations, which says to viruses, attack those with multiple health problems, usually, which are, or rather in many cases, which are the result of poverty and social inequality. So there's no way you can argue this is some kind of external threat. It's a problem we've created, that the system has created. Now, if you then compare that to climate, it's the exact same thing. We based capitalism on the free extraction of energy from carbon energy from the planet, and we didn't realize it was going to. It's not that it would run. We thought it would run out, and of course it will one day run out. But we didn't realize that what would run out was the planet's capacity to absorb the CO2, and that's the problem. So what we do today, the radical thinking we have to do and radical change we have to make in the next 18 months will be a rehearsal for the radical change we have to make in the next 18 years. And I make no apologies for committing myself as a journalist and a writer to the left's answer to this, because the left's answer is the only answer. It is a form of economy in which the state directs investment and in which the priorities of the external threat are greater than the enrichment of a few elite people. So we have got to think beyond climate and COVID virus and beyond capitalism. And I think we can. I think one of my heroes is John Maynard Keynes, liberal economist. At the start of the Second World War, he sat down with his American counterpart, Harry Dexter White. And this is at a time when bombs were falling into the streets outside me where I live in London, and when it was an absolute hopeless situation. America wasn't even in the war. Keynes and Dexter White sat down and they said, what will the world look like when we win? And because they did that, the world I grew up in existed. A world of high social mobility, universal healthcare, universal free education. I think back to I write about it in the book, that the society I grew up in the 1960s, your house was owned by the state, provided by the state, your council house. The water, the gas, the electricity were provided by the state. You didn't really know how much these things cost because they were quite cheap. The railways were owned by the state. The airways were owned by the state. The milk you drank in school was given to you by the state. Was it a disaster? No, it wasn't. It actually was. I don't want to indulge in nostalgia because there's no way we can go back to it. But we need to go forward to a more sustainable society. But this time, see, while we were drinking our free school milk and getting our free dentistry, we were also destroying the planet because we were consuming in the fire grates at home coal. And my dad and my granddad were digging it up from the ground. And we have to stop that. So what we saw around about 2000 was the rebirth of the anti-capitalist imagination around those Seattle and Genoa and Prague protests, some of which I took part in. And then in 2011, I think we saw the beginnings of a mass conversion of people to a kind of the view that another future is possible. And it's very interesting to me that a relatively centre-left politician like Keir Starmer adopted that as his slogan. Another future's got to be possible. But what I think the COVID virus will do is it will accelerate what had already started to happen in politics due to climate. We need a different model of capitalism. That model has to be in transition to a society based on well-being. And everybody who's listening to this who agrees, I think what you need to do is we need to think beyond party boundaries. We need to think beyond community boundaries. We need to actually think about what can I do to make this happen? Because people did that at the start of World War II and during World War II, we ended up with that great 30-year surge of productivity and well-being in most Western countries. I think we can do that. The alternative, and I write quite a lot about it in my book, the alternative is that the far right come forward with the answer. And they say, shut everything down, shut down borders, shut down the global system. It's them and us. You can see elements of this going on quite strongly in the British civil society now, people saying, don't come to my coastal town because you're going to infect me, then you can absolutely bet that the British far right will be straight into those towns saying, let's shut out the newcomers. So we've got a choice to make. I think we have the most, and we've got the most educated generation that's ever lived. They should be able to take that right choice. If we were live here, I'd now say any questions. I'm sure we can find a way of firing questions at me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @PaulMasonNews, or one word. Feel free once this goes up online. But thank you for listening to me, and good luck with the rest of the virtual Imagine Belfast Festival. Take care.